They say corruption begins in the shadows, but sometimes it wears a crown. In the year 1284, a 15-year-old bride entered the gilded halls of the French royal palace. Her name was Isabelle de Navarre, daughter of King Henry of Navarre, chosen to unite two kingdoms through marriage to Philip the Fair, the most powerful monarch in Europe. To the French people, she represented hope, purity, a virgin queen who would bear heirs and embody the virtues expected of royalty. But beneath the silk gowns and jeweled coronets, a darkness was already stirring, one that would transform her into the most scandalous queen in French history. At first, Isabelle played her role flawlessly. Ancient chronicles describe her as possessing extraordinary beauty, with pale skin, raven black hair that cascaded to her waist, and eyes the color of winter storms. She attended Mass daily, smiled graciously at state functions, and bore Philip 4 children in rapid succession. The court whispered that she was the perfect queen, the embodiment of everything a medieval woman should aspire to become. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't have imagined, was what Isabelle did when the candles were extinguished and the palace fell silent. Did you know that according to secret correspondence discovered in the Vatican archives in 1893, Isabelle maintained a hidden chamber beneath the royal chapel? Not for prayer, but for something far darker. The letters written by a horrified confessor priest named Father Guillaume describe in vivid detail what he witnessed through a crack in the stone wall. Noblewomen forced to perform degrading acts while Isabelle watched from a throne-like chair. Knights stripped of their armor and their dignity. Servants coerced into participating in rituals that mocked the very sacraments they had sworn to uphold. But these private gatherings were only the beginning. By 1290, Isabelle had grown bolder, more reckless. She began hosting what she called festivals of Venus, elaborate events disguised as religious celebrations honoring the Virgin Mary. Nobles arrived in their finest garments, expecting solemn hymns and holy devotion. Instead, they found themselves trapped in scenarios carefully orchestrated by the Queen herself. Father Guillaume's letters describe one such evening in chilling detail. The great hall was draped in crimson silk. Golden candelabras cast flickering shadows on the walls. Wine flowed freely, but it was drugged with herbs imported from the East, potions that loosened inhibitions and clouded judgment. As the evening progressed, the music shifted from sacred to sensual. Isabelle, dressed in robes that mimicked priestly vestments, commanded her guests to participate in what she called reenactments of ancient rites. Married noblewomen were paired with men, not their husbands. Knights were forced to compete in contests of endurance that had nothing to do with combat. Those who refused found themselves facing consequences far worse than embarrassment. Their lands were seized, their titles stripped, their reputations destroyed by carefully planted rumors of treason or heresy. Imagine the psychological torment. A duke, proud and powerful, reduced to performing acts that violated everything he believed in, knowing that resistance meant not just his ruin, but the destruction of his entire family. A countess, celebrated for her piety and virtue, forced to choose between her soul and her children as future. Isabelle had discovered something that medieval France was not prepared to confront. That sexual humiliation could be a weapon more devastating than any sword. The most disturbing accounts come from a manuscript found in 1847 in the library of an abandoned monastery near Lyon. Written by an anonymous court lady, it describes what happened inside Isabelle's private apartments. The queen had transformed several rooms of the royal palace into what can only be described as chambers of controlled debauchery. One room, decorated to resemble a pagan temple, featured a raised platform where Isabelle would sit while orchestrating scenarios that pitted noble families against each other in competitions of shame. Another chamber, accessed through a hidden door behind a religious tapestry, contained implements that shocked even the hardened scholars who catalogued them centuries later. But perhaps the most chilling detail is this: Isabelle kept records, detailed accounts of who participated, what they did, who resisted, and how they were punished. These ledgers, partially preserved in the French National Archives, reveal the scope of her operation. Over 300 nobles from the highest ranks of French society were implicated. Bishops, military commanders, royal advisors, all bound together not by loyalty to the crown, but by shared, suffocating shame. Why did she do it? Historians have debated this for centuries. Some argue it was pure lust, an insatiable appetite that no amount of indulgence could satisfy. Others suggest it was a calculated strategy for power, a way to control the nobility through blackmail and fear. But the anonymous court lady's manuscript offers a different explanation, one that rings with disturbing authenticity. She writes, "The queen did not seek pleasure, but dominion. She did not desire bodies, but souls. In forcing the highest nobles to commit the lowest acts, she proved that even the mightiest could be broken, that virtue was merely a mask, easily removed." The turning point came in 1295, during what should have been a solemn celebration of Easter. Isabelle had planned her most audacious spectacle yet. She invited the leading clergymen of France to the palace under the pretense of a special mass honoring the resurrection of Christ. But when they arrived, they found the chapel transformed. The altar had been draped in black silk. The crucifix had been turned upside down, and presiding over it all was Isabelle herself, dressed in robes that were a blasphemous parody of papal vestments. What happened next is documented in multiple sources, including the personal diary of Cardinal Jacques de Terouanne. Isabelle commanded the priests to participate in a ceremony that inverted every sacred ritual they held dear. Holy water was replaced with wine. Prayers were recited backwards. And the climax of the ceremony involved acts so profane that the cardinal's diary, even centuries later, could not bring itself to describe them in full detail. He wrote only this: "I witnessed the Queen of France transform the house of God into the anteroom of hell itself. Several priests fled that night, abandoning their positions at court, but most stayed, bound by the same chains of shame and fear that held the nobility captive. Cardinal de Terouanne himself remained, though his diary reveals the toll it took on his conscience. He wrote, 'I pray for death, for it would be a mercy compared to the knowledge of what I have witnessed and failed to prevent.' But Isabelle's empire of corruption had consequences that extended far beyond individual suffering. The French court, once a model of chivalric virtue, became paralyzed by internal conflict. Nobles who should have been advising the king on matters of state were instead consumed by terror of what Isabelle might reveal. Military commanders, compromised by their participation in her spectacles, found themselves unable to command respect from their troops. The very foundation of French power, built on the concept of noble honor and religious devotion, was being hollowed out from within. Philip the Fair, her husband, was not ignorant of his wife's activities. Multiple sources, including letters from the Templar Knights preserved in their final years before their suppression, indicate that Philip knew exactly what Isabelle was doing, but he did nothing. Some historians argue he was complicit, using her operation to gather intelligence on potential rivals. Others suggest he was simply weak, unable or unwilling to confront a wife who had made herself untouchable through the very secrets she held over the entire court. The breaking point came not from moral outrage but from political necessity. In 1003, tensions with the papacy reached a crisis point. Pope Boniface VIII had issued a bull asserting papal supremacy over all earthly kings, directly threatening Philip's authority. Philip needed the support of his nobles and clergy to resist Rome's demands. But how could he call on them when Isabelle held the power to destroy any of them with a single revelation? The solution, documented in sealed letters only declassified in 1967, was as ruthless as it was calculated. Philip struck a deal with several powerful nobles who had suffered under Isabel's control. In exchange for their support against the Pope, he would arrange for Isabel's permanent removal from court. But it had to appear natural, beyond suspicion. On the morning of April 23, 1305, Queen Isabelle de Navarre died suddenly. The official cause was recorded as a fever, common enough in medieval times to raise no questions. She was 36 years old, but the physician's report, hidden in royal archives for centuries, tells a different story. It describes symptoms consistent with poisoning: violent convulsions, bleeding from the eyes and mouth, paralysis that crept from her extremities to her heart. Her death was met with public mourning and private relief. The nobles who had lived in terror could finally breathe. The priests who had been forced into blasphemy could seek absolution. The servants who had witnessed unspeakable acts could try to forget. Within weeks, workers began dismantling the secret chambers, burning the silk draperies, melting down the golden implements. The ledgers containing her records were supposedly destroyed, though fragments survived, hidden in various archives across Europe. But Isabel's legacy didn't die with her. The damage she had inflicted on the French court persisted for decades. The nobles who had participated in her spectacles found themselves unable to escape the shame, even after her death. Suicide rates among the aristocracy spiked dramatically in the years following 1305. Several prominent families suffered complete collapse, their lines ending not in battle or poverty, but in self-destruction driven by guilt and psychological torment. The church, too, bore scars. Several of the priests who had participated in Isabel's blasphemous ceremonies later became leaders of heretical movements, their faith shattered by what they had been forced to do. 1. A bishop named Henri de Chalon was burned at the stake in 1310 for preaching that if God allowed such evil to flourish in his own house, then perhaps God himself was not worthy of worship. Stand in the Louvre today, and you can still see portraits of Isabelle de Navarre hanging in the royal galleries. She's depicted as young, beautiful, serene, every inch the virtuous queen. But look closely at her eyes in those paintings. Artists of the time had a tradition of hiding truth in symbolism. In every portrait, Isabel's eyes are painted looking away from the viewer, never meeting their gaze. It was the medieval equivalent of a warning. This woman held secrets too dark to confront directly. Archaeological excavations beneath the old royal palace in the 1980s uncovered something that sent shockwaves through the historical community. Workers discovered a sealed chamber, exactly where Father Guillaume's letters had indicated Isabel's hidden room would be. Inside, they found the remains of elaborate frescoes, too damaged to fully restore, but clear enough in their subject matter to leave no doubt about what had occurred there. They also found something else. Dozens of small metal boxes, each containing a lock of hair tied with silk ribbon, and a name carved into the lid. These were Isabel's trophies. Each box represented a noble who had been broken in her chambers. The hair was cut from them at the moment of their greatest humiliation, a physical reminder of her dominion over them. When historians cross-referenced the names on those boxes with historical records, a chilling pattern emerged. Nearly every noble whose hair Isabelle had kept met an early death, many by their own hand, unable to live with the weight of what they had become. The story of Isabelle de Navarre asks a question that echoes across centuries. What happens when the person chosen to embody virtue instead weaponizes vice? Medieval France prided itself on chivalry, honor, and Christian devotion, yet its own queen transformed those very ideals into instruments of torture, proving that the most devastating corruption isn't the kind that announces itself with fire and sword, but the kind that whispers in darkness, turning strength into weakness, faith into doubt, honor into shame. Her reign lasted barely 20 years, but the damage she inflicted persisted for generations. The French monarchy never fully recovered its moral authority. The nobility never regained the unity and purpose that had made France the most powerful kingdom in Europe. And the Church, already struggling with internal corruption, found itself facing questions it couldn't answer. How could God's anointed queen have committed such evil? Why had he allowed it to flourish in his own house? Isabelle de Navarre died more than 700 years ago, but her shadow still lingers. Not in the official histories, which barely mention her beyond dates and children, but in the whispered accounts, the hidden manuscripts, the archaeological evidence that continues to surface. She proved that evil doesn't always arrive with horns and pitchforks. Sometimes it wears a crown, smiles graciously, and destroys from within, one corrupted soul at a time. The ultimate irony is this: Isabelle was buried with full honors in the Basilica of Saint-Denis, the traditional resting place of French royalty. Her tomb, crafted from white marble, depicts her in prayer, hands folded, face serene, the very image of pious devotion. For centuries, pilgrims would pray before her effigy, asking the virtuous queen to intercede for their souls. If only they knew what knelt beneath that marble. The darkness that wore the mask of light, the corruption that called itself righteousness. Isabelle de Navarre's greatest triumph wasn't in the shame she inflicted, or the nobles she controlled. It was in maintaining the illusion until the very end, dying as a beloved queen while her victims carried their secrets to early graves. History books close her chapter with dates and genealogies, but the truth is written in those hidden manuscripts, those sealed chambers, those boxes of hair kept as trophies. The Queen of France was not killed by fever. She was killed because she had become too dangerous to live, because her empire of shame had grown so vast that it threatened to consume the kingdom itself. And in the end, that may be the darkest truth of all, that it took not moral outrage but political necessity to stop her, that France tolerated her evil until it became inconvenient, that the man who poisoned her did so not to save souls, but to save souls, but to save their own power. Isabelle de Navarre was a monster, but she was a monster that medieval France created, enabled, and only destroyed when she threatened the wrong people. The forbidden pleasures of the most corrupted queen weren't just her own. They belonged to an entire system that valued power over virtue, silence over justice, and survival over truth. She may have been buried, her chambers destroyed, her records burned, but the question she posed remains, carved into the foundation of French history, like a wound that never quite heals. What happens when those we trust to uphold civilization